The establishment will never educate against itself, and that's what it would be effectively doing. I go on tour with my band often. One of our favourite places to go on tour is Britain. Is when you go through those great cities, Leeds and Manchester and London and Aberdeen and Glasgow and Edinburgh, the profits of empire are everywhere, and people don't see it. Hey everybody, welcome to Politics, Culture and Some Other Shit. Like, share, subscribe, do the thing. Follow me over on Instagram, Twitter, and if you want to lend me your support for as little as £1 a month, you can head over to my Patreon. Link will be in the description. Okay, so I'm going to talk about an interesting thing that popped up in my news feed about a town, well, in Scotland, Aberdeen, a big town, a city, acknowledging its slave trading past. And it's something, the reason that this sort of sparked my interest specifically was because in this year in the past couple of years we've had the centenary of Northern Ireland, and then with the Queen's Jubilee, Diamond Jubilee, 75, was it 75 or something like that? And of course she died. So there was all the pageantry and everything goes with the celebration of empire. And we know in the UK that people that are pro-United Kingdom, which I am not, but people that are, there's no acknowledgement of the sins of empire. Very little. If it is acknowledged, it's kind of tacitly sort of, like people go, oh yeah, we know. Well, I don't think they do know. I think they say they know, they'll acknowledge that it was a bad thing. So they'll say, well, Britain ended the slave trade. Well, Britain fucking started it as well. So, and we'll talk about that. So let's get into it. So the reason, so I'm going to start here with this article. Get this up. Remember this? Edward Colson in Bristol, the statue. Do you remember that? Getting threw into the drink there in Bristol in the harbour, which was fantastic. So I'll just read it out to you here. The statue of Edward Colson is a bronze statue of a Bristol-born merchant and transatlantic slave trader, Edward Colson. He was born in 1636. It was created in 1895 by the Irish sculptor John Cassidy and was formerly erected on a plinth of Portland stone in a public park known as the Centre until it was toppled by anti-racism protesters in 2020. So we remember that. That was a big deal. Okay. Well, I remember. I'm sure you do too. The statue became controversial by the end of the 20th century as Colson's activities as a major slave trader became more widely known. H.T. Wilkins, who uncovered his slave trading activities in 1920, commented, "We cannot picture him justly except against his historical background. Colson's involvement in the slave trade predated the abolition movement in Britain and was during a time when slavery was generally condoned in England, indeed throughout Europe, by churchmen, intellectuals and the educated classes. From the 1990s onwards, campaigns, petitions called for the removal of the statue." So, now we move on to the 21st century, and a poll in 2014 in the local newspaper, the Bristol Post, 56% of the 1,100 respondents said it should stay, while 44% wanted it to go. Others called for a memorial plaque honouring the victims of slavery to be fitted to his statue. So this is the point, right? Whenever the protesters took the statue down, ripped it down and threw it into the sea, into the water, at the dock, which was sort of poetic because the dock itself was actually one of the original docks that those slave trading ships sailed from, and then that memorial statue to Colson was fucked into it. So whenever they tore the statue down, people that were condemning that act of vandalism, as they would see it, said, well, let's not rip all these things down. Because then there was a wider sort of call went out and said, well, do we need to start taking all these down? Because they're everywhere, you know, all over the country. statues and memorials and architectural pieces of architecture, grand buildings, libraries, halls, all public spaces, all paid for by the slave trade. Do we need to start to... And the people that were the anti-racism campaigners saying, yes, we need to start putting up plaques and educating people in schools and taking these statues down as well. And then the opposition would say, well, no, we need to just educate the people and put a plaque up. And then their thing came back, said, well, we've been trying to put a plaque on that statue from the 60s, which they had been. And they'd been constantly delayed at council level. And they were trying to put the plaque on the statue, and they couldn't. They couldn't get it done until it boiled over and they threw it in the drink. But this is my point. They're never going to tell you about it. This was my point back then. They were never going to tell you about it. I did a video about it at the time. They're never going to tell you about it. They're never going to educate the children, because the establishment will never educate against itself. And that's what it would be effectively doing. I go on tour with my band often, as you know. And one of our favourite places to go on tour is Britain, is, you know, England, Scotland and Wales. And especially in England and Scotland, when you go through those great cities, Leeds and Manchester and London and Aberdeen and Glasgow and Edinburgh, the profits of empire are everywhere. And people don't see it. Those grand high streets, those big buildings, they're all paid for from the profits of empire. The empire is cruel, inherently cruel. It doesn't buy, it doesn't ask. It steals and takes and kills and destroys. Creates narratives and fictions that allows ordinary men to go out and commit a cruelty to an ordinary man in another part of the world because he lives there, because he looks differently or behaves differently, talks differently. The othering of them, they are othered, they're dehumanised. And I see it all the time everywhere I go. Luckily here in Belfast, or here in the north, the main city is Belfast, of course, and there's none of that there. I think there might be one or two little things, but they're minor, they're relatively minor. But nonetheless, you know, Belfast was a part of the empire, and it's guilty by association. So, but anyway, I digress, as is my wont. So, on to this. Now, this is fantastic. This is amazing, actually. Let me just get this. So, then, slavery was abolished, as we know. Okay? And here is an article from taxjustice.net. Right? And you can't believe it. This is amazing. Okay? Check this out. It's hard to believe, but it was only in 2015 that, according to the Treasury, British taxpayers finished paying off the debt which the British government incurred in order to compensate British slave owners in 1835. So slavery was abolished in 1835. Well, it was abolished before that, but they came to the agreement that they're going to compensate who? The slaves? No, the slave owners. The slaves didn't get anything. The slave owners and slaves in America, as we know, they were still living under, well, you could argue today, I would go so far as to say that the prison industrial complex would be a kick on from the Jim Crow laws and all, and then before that was slavery. So they paid the slave owners, but they did not the slaves, which is amazing in itself. But get this, only in 2015 was that debt paid. So from 1835 to 2015, that's almost 200 years. 180 years, if my maths is correct. So back to the article. Abolition meant their profiteering from human misery would gradually in brackets, come to an end. Not a penny was paid to those who were enslaved and brutalised. The British government borrowed £20 million to compensate slave owners, a massive amount of money at the time, which amounted to a massive 40% of the Treasury's annual income, or about 5% of GDP. The loan was one of the largest in history. Jesus. We wanted to find out which financial institutions were involved in this loan. So I sent 2 Freedom of Information requests to the UK Treasury, the Bank of England, about it. I received 2 responses, which I'll detail later. So he goes into it. So, the legacies. So Chris Manjapra writes, the legacies of slavery continue to shape life for the descendants of the formerly enslaved and for everyone who lives in Britain, whatever their origin. The legacies of slavery in Britain are not far off. They are in front of our eyes every single day. And they are. If you wake up to it, if you can start to see the world a little differently, look at that grand city hall and go, or town, why is that? Wonder who paid for that? What paid for that? I read there the other day that Britain extracted 40 trillion, the equivalent of 40 trillion pounds from India. And this idea that the empire's going to go there as this great civilizing father or mother to help the natives, these poor countries. You don't put an army in a ship and sail it for months halfway around the world to another country because it's poor. Right? Dude, because they're rich. You want to take their shit? Chris Manjapra's article, along with the work of historian David Olusoga, inspired this blog. So the British taxpayers would never have discovered they'd completed these loan repayments in 2015. Would you hear this? If someone in the British government's Treasury Department hadn't posted this on its official Twitter channel to its hundreds of thousands of followers. And there's the tweet. HM Treasury, here's today's surprising #Friday fact. There we go. Isn't that lovely? Millions of you helped end the slave trade through your taxes. And there's a little infographic there. Isn't that just delightful? That's just fantastic. The tweet was subsequently deleted, but not before this insult, and the secret was out. Right? This is insane. Which David Olusoga writes about here. Here's one of his responses to that Treasury tweet. So basically, my father and his children and grandchildren have been paying taxes to compensate those who enslaved our ancestors, and you want me to be proud of that fact? Are you fucking insane? He says. The Treasury tweet shows slavery is still, misunderstood. And so it does, and so it is, so misunderstood. So that's an amazing article. Here's just on the. I'm not going to read it because this blog is a good one. It's worth reading. I'll put the link in the profile. After he goes on, he says, after a lesson at school where Britain and its empire was glorified, with my teacher stating, "Look how powerful we were." It took 4 years for me to go and find a book which accurately articulated the impact colonialism has had on this country. So, think about that. In 1835, the slave trade having ended shortly before it, £20 million loan was granted to the British Treasury, the British government, from the Treasury, from the banks, in order to compensate the slave owners, not the slaves. Slaves still have never been given anything. The biggest loan, one of the biggest loans in history, 5% of GDP of the British Empire, which was on its massive, still rising at the time, still conquering at the time. Insane. So, where does this bring us to today? So check this out. So I was talking about they won't educate against themselves. The establishment won't educate against themselves. Remember, people were saying, don't rip the statues down, just tell people who these people were. That's a lovely idea, but it will never happen. I was wrong. Check it out. Powis Gateway, a plaque to mark the slavery links of Old Aberdeen landmark. So this is a part of a wider project. This is it here. Project to recognise Aberdeen's history with slavery put on hold. So the project's there. The council couldn't, for financial reasons, couldn't follow through with it, but it's not been done away with. It's just on hold. So this is Powis Gateway. This is what they've got done so far. A plaque will be put up explaining how profits from the slave trade were used to create a picturesque archway in Old Aberdeen. Powis Gateway has stood opposite Aberdeen's University College for nearly 200 years. Right? So that was in June this year. And there we go. The plaque is up. Plaque unveiled at Powis Gateway to recognise Old Aberdeen's links to slavery. A plaque recognising the legacy of slavery in the North East has been erected outside Powis Gateway in Old Aberdeen. The historic gateway was built by the Leslie family, was funded using compensation following the abolition of slavery in Britain's Caribbean colonies in 1834. So that the compensation that they were given, remember we've just spoke about that they got from the government, a part of that, the compensation that the Leslie family received as slave traders, was used to build this gateway. Now owned by Aberdeen University, the structure is a symbol of the profiteering from slavery between the Caribbean and North East Scotland. The gateway was built using £7,000, equivalent of £600,000 in today's money, that the Leslie family received from the British government due to their loss of slaves. Slaves who worked for the Leslie family did not receive any money for the years of suffering and unpaid labour they were forced to endure. Powis Gateway represents historic inequality, further highlighted during the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests. So that's what the Colson statue, remember we started with that? The new plaque makes clear that was a part of the Black Lives Matter protests, which went, well, pretty much global, didn't they? The new plaque makes clear the history behind the site as part of Aberdeen Council's commemorative plaque scheme, so they're going to do more. It's also a part of a wider programme to recognise and address the links between Aberdeen University and North East Scotland and slavery. So there you go. So there's the plaque, and it says on it, I'll read it out to you, Powis Gateway was built in the early 1830s by the Leslie family using profits from slavery. The Leslies, the lairds of nearby Powis House, owned an estate in Jamaica on which they forced enslaved African people to work. After the 1833 Act for the Abolition of Slavery, the Leslies received government compensation, which also helped fund the gateway. The formerly enslaved people received nothing for their years of unpaid labour and suffering. And then it says the city of Aberdeen. So that's a good way. I think that's a good way, because these are your options. Do nothing and live in the shadow of these things. You can either live in ignorance, and if you know what it is, you have to pass it and just be quiet, say nothing, and be disgusted by its very existence. Put up a plaque telling people what it is, or bulldoze it, right? Those basically are your options. I think this is a good way of going about it. If you wanted to bulldoze it too, I wouldn't care. So there we go. Isn't that interesting? So Aberdeen, Moi Hu, Aberdeen, that's very good. Well done. I hope that you get the rest of the plaques up and get everything built. It's very good. So yeah, bravo.